On August 12, 2021, police officers in Moab, Utah responded to a 911 call. A witness reported seeing a man slapping a woman outside a white Ford Transit van near the Moonflower Co-op. When officers pulled the van over, they found a young couple. The woman was crying uncontrollably. Scratches covered the man's face and arms. Both of them told the police it was just a minor argument, a misunderstanding, nothing serious. The officers separated them for the night and let them go. 29 days later, that young woman's body was found in a shallow grave in the Wyoming wilderness. Her name was Gabby Petito. She was 22 years old. And the man sitting next to her in that van, her fiancé, Brian Laundrie, had already driven home to Florida, alone, without telling anyone what happened. But this story doesn't start on the side of a Utah highway. It starts with a girl on Long Island who dreamed of seeing the world and the boy she thought would take her there. Gabrielle Venora Petito grew up in Blue Point, a small town on Long Island's South Shore. If you've never been there, picture quiet residential streets about an hour east of New York City. The kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors and kids ride their bikes to the beach in the summer. Gabby was the oldest of 6 children in a blended family. Her biologist, Nicole Schmidt, had divorced when she was young, and both eventually remarried. By all accounts, it was a loving family, complicated in the way that blended families often are, but close. From an early age, Gabby stood out as creative. She loved art. She loved being outdoors, and she had a warmth about her that people noticed immediately. Friends and family would later describe her as someone who lit up every room she walked into. She attended Bayport Blue Point High School, where she was involved in various activities and was remembered as friendly and well-liked. But Gabby's real passion was never going to fit inside a classroom. She wanted to travel, see the country, and build something creative with her life, and that desire is what eventually led her to Brian Laundrie. Brian Laundrie grew up in Northport, Florida, a planned community on the Gulf Coast about an hour south of Tampa. He was quiet, introverted, and by his own description, a bit of a loner. He was into art, specifically sketching and drawing, and he read constantly. He also had a thing for the outdoors, particularly hiking and camping in remote areas. Gabby and Brian met through mutual friends when they were both still in high school. Despite living in different states, they started a long-distance relationship that eventually became serious enough for Gabby to move down to Florida. By 2019, she was living with Brian and his parents, Chris and Roberta Laundrie, at their home on Wabasso Avenue in Northport. And that's when the plan started to take shape. The van life movement was exploding on social media at the time. You've probably seen the aesthetic. Young couples converting vans into tiny homes on wheels, posting gorgeous photos from national parks, living free and untethered from the 9-to-5 grind. It looked like the ultimate dream. And it was everywhere in 2020 and 2021. The pandemic had made people restless, stuck at home, desperate for some version of freedom. Van life accounts were racking up millions of followers. Couples with matching Patagonia jackets and golden retriever puppies were pulling in sponsorship deals, turning their lifestyle into a full-time income. The message was simple. You don't need a house, a career, or a plan. You just need a van, a partner, and an Instagram account. What the hashtag didn't show you was the reality. Mechanical breakdowns in the middle of nowhere, arguments about money when the sponsorships don't come, and the suffocating closeness of sharing every waking minute with another person in a space smaller than most bathrooms. Van life content was selling a fantasy, and a lot of young couples were buying it. Gabby and Brian wanted in. They bought a 2012 white Ford Transit van, and Brian, who was handy, helped convert the interior into a livable space. Meanwhile, Gabby built out their social media presence. She created a YouTube channel called Nomadic Static. and started documenting the conversion process. Her Instagram grew steadily. The posts were aspirational, exactly what you'd expect. Bright colors, big smiles, beautiful landscapes in the background. She was building a brand around the idea of freedom, adventure, and living life on your own terms. And if you only looked at the Instagram feed, you'd think everything was perfect. But social media has a way of showing you exactly what someone wants you to see. The smiles, the sunsets, the golden hour photos. What it doesn't show you is what happens when the camera turns off. And behind the carefully curated feed, there were already signs that things between Gabby and Brian weren't as picture-perfect as they appeared. Friends would later tell reporters that the couple argued frequently, that Brian could be controlling, particularly about Gabby's social media use. He didn't always like being filmed. He didn't always support her desire to build an audience. There was a tension between Gabby's outgoing, camera-friendly personality and Brian's preference for solitude and privacy. There were also financial pressures. Van life isn't free. Gas, campground fees, food, insurance, vehicle maintenance. And when you're just starting out as a content creator with a small following, the money isn't flowing in yet. Every dollar spent on the road was a dollar they had to figure out before the revenue arrived. None of this was visible online. The Nomadic Static brand was selling freedom and joy, and that's all anyone saw. In early 2021, Gabby and Brian got engaged. They never set a wedding date, but the engagement added another layer to what they were presenting to the world. Young, couple in love, about to embark on the adventure of a lifetime. Their families were supportive. Joe Petito and Nicole Schmidt, Gabby's parents, were excited for her. They knew she'd always wanted to travel, and this felt like Gabby finally going after her dream. What none of them knew was that the cross-country trip they were about to take would be the last time anyone outside of Brian Laundrie would see Gabby Petito alive. On July 2, 2021, Gabby and Brian left Northport, Florida, in their white Ford Transit van. The plan was ambitious. They were going to drive across the country, hitting as many national parks as possible over the course of several months. Gabby would document the whole thing for YouTube and Instagram. It was supposed to be the content that launched their brand. Their route took them north through the eastern states first. They stopped at various parks and campgrounds along the way, and Gabby posted regularly to Instagram. The photos were exactly what their small but growing audience wanted to see. Smiling faces in front of waterfalls, cooking meals by the campfire, sleeping in the van under the stars. For the first few weeks, everything seemed to be going well. At least, that's what the social media suggested. They visited spots in New York, Kansas, and Colorado before heading toward the great national parks of the American West. But living in a van with another person sounds romantic until you actually do it. That van was roughly 70 square feet of living space. There was nowhere to retreat after a fight, no separate room to cool off in, no way to just be alone with your thoughts when things got tense, and things were getting tense. By late July and early August, something had shifted. The posts became less frequent. The energy changed. And while none of the followers would have picked up on it at the time, Gabby's family later said they noticed small things in their phone calls and text messages. Gabby seemed stressed. She mentioned that Brian was having mood swings, that he didn't always support her social media ambitions. She played it down the way people often do. Then came August 12, 2021. And this is where the story takes a turn that would later haunt everyone involved. Gabby and Brian had been in the Moab area for a couple of days, visiting Arches National Park and the surrounding desert. That afternoon, a 911 caller reported witnessing a domestic dispute near the Moonflower Co-op, a grocery and cafe in downtown Moab. The caller told the dispatcher that a man had been seen slapping a woman, and the couple then drove off in a white van. Minutes later, Moab City police officers located the van and pulled it over on the side of U.S. Route 191. What happened during that traffic stop would become the most scrutinized piece of police footage in 2021, and for good reason. Because what the officers found, what they saw, and what they decided to do next would be second-guessed by millions of people around the world. When officers approached the van, Gabby was in hysterics. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. Her face was blotchy and swollen. Brian, meanwhile, was calmer, almost eerily calm by comparison. He had visible scratches on his face and the side of his neck. Both Gabby and Brian told the officers they'd been arguing. Gabby said the fight had escalated. She admitted to hitting Brian first, grabbing at his face while he was trying to drive. Brian confirmed this version of events. And this is where it gets complicated, and where millions of people would later tear this encounter apart frame by frame. Gabby was doing something that domestic violence experts call reactive abuse admission. When a victim in an abusive relationship fights back even once, they often feel enormous guilt about it. And when law enforcement shows up, they'll lead with their own behavior. I hit him. I started it. It was my fault. They're conditioned to take the blame that they literally incriminate themselves while protecting their abuser. Brian, on the other hand, was composed. He talked to the officers like they were old friends. He was polite, self-deprecating, even a little charming. He told them Gabby could get crazy sometimes, that she had anxiety issues, and that he was just trying to calm her down. One of the officers later said Brian reminded him of a prior version of myself, suggesting he related to Brian's description of dealing with an emotional partner. But here's what the officers didn't hear. They didn't have the full 911 call. The original caller described seeing a man hit a woman and then the couple driving off. A second witness, who called independently, described the man as aggressive. These details either weren't relayed to the responding officers or were lost in the chaos of the response. The officers on the scene only knew about a domestic disturbance between a couple. They didn't have the full picture. After roughly an hour of discussion, the officers made a decision. They classified the incident as a mental health crisis rather than a domestic violence situation. Under Moab City guidelines, they separated the couple for the night. Brian was given a hotel room. Gabby stayed in the van. And that was that. Nobody was arrested, nobody was charged, and there was no follow-up. The officers were friendly with both Gabby and Brian throughout the encounter. They even laughed with Brian at certain points. One officer told Gabby she had a beautiful smile and should try to enjoy the trip. Now, watching this footage with the knowledge of what happened 29 days later, it's almost unbearable to sit through, because every red flag that we can now see so clearly was sitting right in front of those officers. Gabby was terrified. She minimized the situation in the exact way that victims of domestic violence often do. She blamed herself, and Brian played it cool, controlled the narrative, stayed composed. The Moab Police Department would later face an independent investigation over their handling of the stop. The report concluded that the officers had made several errors, including failing to cite Brian for domestic violence as required by Utah law, and failing to identify Gabby as the likely victim despite behavioral indicators. But on August 12, 2021, none of that mattered yet. The couple was separated for the night, and the next morning they were back together in the van, continuing their trip as if nothing had happened. This decision, this single moment where the system had a chance to intervene and didn't, would become one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. After the Moab incident, Gabby and Brian continued heading north through Utah and into Wyoming. They visited Canyonlands, then made their way toward Grand Teton National Park and the town of Jackson. On August 19th, Gabby and Brian checked into the Fairfield Inn in Salt Lake City, Utah. This was unusual because the whole point of the trip was living out of the van. Checking into a hotel in the middle of the trip suggested that something was going on. Maybe they needed space. Maybe the van was too small for whatever tension had been building. They checked out the next day and continued north toward Grand Teton. During this stretch, Gabby was still in contact with her family. She texted her mother, Nicole Schmidt, regularly. The messages were mostly normal. Updates about where they were, what they were seeing, casual back and forth. But Nicole would later tell investigators that something felt off. Gabby's texts were shorter than usual. She seemed distracted. When Nicole asked how things were going with Brian, Gabby changed the subject. On August 25th, Gabby posted what would be her final Instagram photo. It was taken at the Monarch Butterfly Pavilion in Grand Teton. She's smiling, standing among the butterflies, looking exactly like the carefree van life influencer she was trying to become. That photo got thousands of likes, comments from followers, telling her how beautiful she looked, how jealous they were of her lifestyle, how they wished they could do the same thing. Nobody looking at that photo would have guessed what was happening off camera. Nobody would have imagined that within days the girl in that photo would be dead. After August 25th, Gabby's social media went silent. Over the next few days, multiple witnesses would later come forward to report seeing the couple at various locations in the Jackson and Grand Teton area. Some of these sightings painted a picture of a couple that seemed happy. Others told a different story. One witness, a woman named Nina Selly Angelo, told reporters that she and her boyfriend had dinner with Gabby and Brian at a restaurant called the Merry Piglets in Jackson on August 27th. During the meal, she said Brian became agitated with the restaurant staff. He was rude, argumentative. Gabby was visibly embarrassed and apologized for his behavior. Angelo described watching Gabby go back and forth between the van and the restaurant, and she could see Gabby was upset. The Merry Piglets incident is significant because it places Gabby and Brian together in Jackson just days before she disappeared. And it showed the same pattern that the Moab officers had witnessed 2 weeks earlier, Brian losing his temper, while Gabby tried to smooth things over and apologized for his behavior. On that same day, August 27th, Gabby sent a message to her mother that said, "Can you help Stan? I just prior to prior to prior." The message was garbled, almost nonsensical. Nicole thought it was strange. Gabby never called her grandfather Stan. She always called him Grandpa. Now, what actually happened between August 27th and the end of August remains one of the most closely examined timelines in recent true crime history, because this is the window in which Gabby Petito was killed. The FBI later established that Gabby died sometime between August 27th and August 30th. Her body was found at a dispersed camping area in the Bridger Teton National Forest, about 900 feet from a dirt road, in an area called Spread Creek. It was a remote spot, the kind of place where people camp without reservations, park along forest roads, and might not see another person for days. And that's exactly what made it so difficult for investigators later. Few witnesses, no security cameras, just wilderness. And this is the part that everyone missed at the time, but it would eventually crack the case wide open. A travel vlogger couple named Jen and Kyle Bethune were driving through the Spread Creek area on August 27th with their dash cam running. Their footage, which they didn't review until weeks later, captured a white Ford Transit van parked on the side of the road in the exact spot where Gabby's body would eventually be found. That footage helped the FBI narrow down the timeline. The van was there on August 27th. Gabby's phone stopped sending messages shortly after. And Brian Laundrie, according to his own movements, left the area alone not long after. What happened at that campsite is something only Brian Laundrie ever knew for certain, but the coroner's report would later confirm the cause of death. Manual strangulation. Gabby Petito, 22 years old, was strangled to death and left in a shallow grave in the Wyoming wilderness. Her body lay there for weeks before anyone found her, exposed to the elements, while the rest of the world had no idea she was even missing. And on August 30th, a text was sent from Gabby's phone to her mother. No service in Yosemite. But Gabby's planned route never included Yosemite. The family had never discussed Yosemite as part of the trip. Investigators would later conclude that this text was not sent by Gabby. It was sent by Brian Laundrie, using her phone to buy time to make it look like she was alive and traveling when she was already dead in that Wyoming campsite. Because the person who knew exactly what had happened was already halfway across the country, driving that white van back to Florida, alone. If you've made it this far into this story, you already know this case gets worse before it gets any better. If you're not subscribed, now's the time, because what Brian Laundrie did next is the part that made the entire country lose its mind. On September 1st, 2021, Brian Laundrie pulled the white Ford Transit van into his parents' driveway at 23 Wabasso Avenue in Northport. He'd driven approximately 20,500 miles from Wyoming to Florida without Gabby, and he didn't say a word to anyone about where she was. For 10 days, Brian lived at home with his parents, Chris and Roberta Laundrie, as if nothing had happened. He went about his normal routine. Neighbors later told reporters they saw Brian mowing the lawn, riding his bike, and even going on a hike with his mother. One neighbor, who had always seen Gabby and Brian together, said he asked Brian where Gabby was. Brian didn't answer, just walked away. Think about that for a second. A man allegedly strangles his fiancée, leaves her body in the wilderness, drives her van 20,500 miles home, and then spends the next 10 days mowing and riding bikes while her mother calls and texts frantically, wondering why her daughter has gone silent. On September 1st, the same day he got home, he and his mother were seen moving around normally. A few days later, Brian and his parents went on a camping trip to Fort DeSoto Park, about 75 miles north of their house, a family camping trip. While Gabby Petito's body was decomposing in a Wyoming forest, the Laundrie family went camping. That detail alone was enough to make millions of people furious when it came out later. And the question of what Brian told his parents and when has never been fully answered. Meanwhile, Gabby's family was growing desperate. Nicole Schmidt had been trying to reach Gabby for days. The texts weren't going through. The calls went straight to voicemail. At first, Nicole assumed it was a service issue. Maybe Gabby was in a remote area with no signal. That happened often enough on cross-country road trips. But as the days went on and the silence continued, Nicole's worry turned into alarm. She reached out to Brian but got nothing. She reached out to Brian's mother, Roberta, and got nothing there either. She tried every channel she could think of, and every single one came back silent. On September 11, 2021, Gabby's family filed a missing person report with the Suffolk County Police Department in New York. That report is what triggered everything that followed. When detectives from Northport contacted the Laundrie family to ask about Gabby's whereabouts, they were met with silence. Brian Laundrie refused to speak with police. And then, on the advice of what appeared to be prearranged legal counsel, the Laundrie family released a statement through their attorney, Stephen Bertolino. The statement said the family would have no comment and directed all inquiries to the lawyer. That was it. A 22-year-old woman was missing, her fiancé had driven home without her, and the only people who might know what happened were refusing to cooperate. The case exploded. Within 48 hours of the missing person report, Gabby Petito's face was everywhere. The story had every element that captures public attention. A young, photogenic woman, A van life story ripped straight from Instagram, a silent, uncooperative boyfriend, and a family desperately searching for answers. Social media went into overdrive. The hashtag #FindGabby trended across every platform. Amateur sleuths, armchair detectives, and true crime communities started combing through every piece of content Gabby and Brian had ever posted. They analyzed Instagram captions for hidden meanings. They mapped out timelines. They cross-referenced witness sightings with gas station security footage. TikTok became a particularly intense hub for the investigation. Users posted hundreds of videos breaking down the body camera footage, zooming into Gabby's facial expressions, analyzing Brian's word choices, comparing the couple's Instagram posts to a timeline of known events. Some of the analysis was insightful. A lot of it was speculative. But the sheer volume of attention was staggering. Within a week, Gabby Petito was the most searched name on Google. Her case was leading every major news broadcast in the country. Tips to the FBI hotline numbered in the thousands. The attention had real consequences. It was a TikTok user who first identified the significance of the Bethune dashcam footage. It was social media users who pressured the Moab Police Department to release the body camera video. And it was the relentless public scrutiny that kept pressure on law enforcement to treat this as a priority case rather than a routine missing person report. But the attention also created problems. The Laundrie family received death threats. Neighbors on Wabasso Avenue had their lives disrupted by the constant media presence. And investigators had to wade through thousands of false tips generated by well-meaning but misguided amateur detectives who were convinced they'd cracked the case. And then the Moab body camera footage leaked. When the public saw that video, saw Gabby crying and apologizing to police while Brian sat there calmly explaining away the situation, the fury was immediate and overwhelming. People weren't just angry at Brian Laundrie. They were angry at the system, at the officers who let them go, at a culture that enables abusers to control the narrative. On September 19, 2021, 8 days after the missing person report was filed, the FBI and the National Park Service made an announcement that Gabby's family had been dreading. A body matching Gabby Petito's description had been found at the Spread Creek dispersed camping area in Bridger-Teton National Forest. The next day, the Teton County coroner, Dr. Brent Blue, confirmed the identity. It was Gabby. The manner of death was ruled a homicide, and on October 12th, the cause of death was officially announced as manual strangulation. She'd been dead for approximately 3 to 4 weeks before she was found. Her body had been lying in that wilderness, in the shadow of the Teton Range, while her family begged for information and the world watched. But while the country was mourning Gabby and demanding answers, there was another problem. Brian Laundrie was gone. On September 17th, 2 days before Gabby's body was found, Brian Laundrie's parents told police that their son had left for a hike at the Carlton Reserve, a 25,000-acre nature preserve near their home, on September 13th and hadn't returned. September 13th. That was 2 days after Gabby's family filed the missing person report, which meant Brian Laundrie vanished just as the investigation was heating up. The timing was impossible to ignore. The FBI issued a federal arrest warrant for Brian on September 23rd, though it was for unauthorized use of a debit card, specifically Gabby's Capital One card, which he'd used to make purchases between August 30th and September 1st as he drove home from Wyoming. It wasn't a murder charge, but it gave law enforcement the legal authority to arrest him on site. What followed was one of the most intensive manhunts in recent American history. The FBI, local police, and specialized search teams focused on the Carlton Reserve, a sprawling wilderness of swamps, gator-infested waterways, and nearly impenetrable vegetation. Day after day, search crews waded through waist-deep water, used sonar equipment, deployed drones, and brought in tracking dogs. The media camped outside the reserve. Reporters broadcast live from the perimeter. The entire country watched and waited. The Carlton Reserve is not a forgiving landscape. It's subtropical swampland, thick with palmettos, mangroves, and standing water. Alligators live there. Rattlesnakes live there. The ground floods routinely during the rainy season, and in September and October, large sections of the reserve were completely underwater. The conditions made the search agonizing. Teams could only cover small sections at a time. Equipment got stuck. Visibility underwater was near zero. Multiple areas that were searched early had to be researched later when water levels dropped and new terrain became accessible. Meanwhile, the case had become a media event unlike anything in recent memory. Cable news ran near continuous coverage. Reporters camped outside the laundry home 24 hours a day. Protesters showed up on the sidewalk. At one point, Brian's parents were followed to their driveway by people yelling at them to talk. Tips poured in from across the country. Brian was supposedly spotted in Alabama, on the Appalachian Trail, in Mexico, even in Canada. None of the tips checked out. Every false sighting burned resources and time. Meanwhile, the scrutiny on Brian's parents intensified. The public wanted to know what Chris and Roberta Laundrie knew, and when they knew it. The camping trip to Fort DeSoto, the immediate lawyering up, the refusal to cooperate. Everything about their behavior suggested they were protecting their son. Gabby's family was vocal about their frustration. Joe Petito and Nicole Schmidt appeared on national television, pleading for the Laundries to speak up. In one interview, Joe Petito made a direct appeal. The Laundrie family's attorney maintained that his clients had done nothing wrong and were cooperating with the search for Brian. Then, on October 20th, 2021, 5 weeks after Brian disappeared, the search came to an end. Chris and Roberta Laundrie went to the Myakkahatchee Creek Environmental Park, an area adjacent to the Carlton Reserve that had recently been reopened after flooding. They told law enforcement they wanted to search for Brian themselves. Remarkably, within just a couple of hours of entering the park with law enforcement, remains were discovered partially submerged in an area that had been underwater for weeks. The speed of that discovery raised immediate questions. How did Chris and Roberta know to look there? Had they known all along where Brian was? Their attorney said they had simply gone to an area they knew Brian liked to hike, but the timing felt deeply suspicious to a public that had spent 5 weeks watching the Laundrie family say nothing. The remains were identified as Brian Laundrie through dental records. The body had been submerged in swamp water for weeks, making any other form of identification impossible. Near his body, investigators found a notebook, a backpack, and a revolver. The medical examiner later confirmed Brian died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and the notebook. The notebook that was found near his remains contained what the FBI described as a written confession. In it, Brian claimed responsibility for Gabby's death. According to statements released later, Brian wrote that he ended Gabby's life in what he described as an act of mercy, claiming she was injured and in pain and asking him to end her suffering. The FBI did not find evidence to support that version of events. The coroner ruled Gabby's death a homicide by manual strangulation, with no indication of the injuries Brian described. With Brian Laundrie dead, there would never be a trial, never be a cross-examination, never be an opportunity for Gabby's family to face the man responsible and hear a full accounting of what happened in those final days in Wyoming. The case was officially closed by the FBI in January 2022. But for Gabby's family, nothing was closed. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Laundrie estate, which was eventually settled. They also filed a lawsuit against the Moab Police Department for their handling of the August 12th traffic stop. arguing that the officers' failure to properly identify the domestic violence situation contributed to Gabby's death. An independent investigation into the Moab Police Department found that the responding officers had made several unintentional mistakes during the traffic stop, including failing to issue mandatory citations under Utah's domestic violence laws. The investigation recommended policy changes, additional training, and revisions to how Moab officers handle domestic disputes. But policy changes don't bring someone back. In the aftermath of Gabby's death, her family channeled their grief into advocacy. In 2022, Gabby's parents successfully lobbied for the passage of new legislation. The Gabby Petito Responsible Reauthorization Act was introduced in Congress, aimed at improving law enforcement response to domestic violence, strengthening protections for victims, and increasing resources for missing persons cases. Nicole Schmidt founded the Gabby Petito Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence and providing resources for families of missing persons. Through the foundation, Gabby's mother has spoken publicly about the warning signs that she wishes she'd followed up on harder, and the impossible guilt that comes with wondering whether anything could have been done differently. The case also forced a broader conversation about something uncomfortable. While Gabby Petito's case received overwhelming media coverage and public attention, critics pointed out that thousands of missing persons cases, particularly those involving people of color, indigenous women, and people from lower-income communities, receive little to no coverage at all. The term missing white woman syndrome trended alongside High-Find Gabby, and activists used the moment to highlight cases that had been overlooked for years. In Wyoming alone, the state where Gabby was found, hundreds of indigenous women had gone missing or been murdered on or near the Wind River Reservation with a fraction of the attention or resources. It was a valid criticism, and one that Gabby's own family acknowledged. In interviews, Joe Petito said he hoped his daughter's case would bring attention to all missing persons, not just those who look like Gabby. He said Gabby would have wanted that. The case also sparked a national conversation about domestic violence, about the ways the system fails victims, about how abusers control narratives, and about the gap between what we see on social media and what's actually happening behind the screen. Domestic violence hotlines reported a surge in calls in the weeks following Gabby's case making national news. Advocacy organizations said people were reaching out not just because of the coverage, but because they recognized their own relationships in what they saw on that Moab body camera footage. They saw their own excuses in Gabby's words. They saw their own partner's behavior in Brian's calm, calculated composure. So what did Gabby Petito discover before she disappeared? She discovered that the van life dream she'd been chasing looked nothing like the Instagram posts. She discovered that the man she loved was capable of something she probably never imagined. She discovered in her final days that she was trapped thousands of miles from home in a 70-square-foot van with someone who was becoming increasingly dangerous. And the system that was supposed to protect her, the police officers who pulled over that van in Moab and saw a terrified young woman crying in the passenger seat, they discovered something too. They discovered too late that letting someone go is not the same as making sure they're safe. Gabby Petito was 22 years old. She wanted to be a travel blogger, to see every national park and share them with the world. More than anything, she wanted to live a life worth documenting, and in a terrible, tragic way, she did. If this case stuck with you the way it stuck with me, you should watch this next. It's another case where the warning signs were right in front of everyone, and nobody acted until it was too late. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next one.